Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Carolyn and I talk a lot about books. In particular, I talk a lot about classic literature, and a question that has been on so many people's minds for years and years and years is, what is a classic book and how do you define a classic book? And this is a question that has started many debates and many arguments, but today I really want to bring it to the forefront and make it into this video and ask myself and ask you guys, how do you define a classic book? I don't want this to turn into us getting into an argument or becoming a debate or anything. I just think it's such a fascinating topic to discuss and to talk about, and I think it's interesting how different people define one term, specifically about classic literature, because it's such a passion of mine. So anyway, today I am going to be telling you the 5 ways that I define a classic, and I'm also going to be explaining and giving you examples of my definitions and the examples of those definitions, if that makes absolutely any sense. But anyway, so I would love to know in the comments the different ways that you define a classic, and I think that it would just be really interesting to have that discussion with each other. So anyway, here are my 5 ways of how I define a classic book. For me, the number one key to a classic book is a book that has stood the test of time, with themes, characters, plots, and storylines that are universal no matter what time period it is. And a perfect example of this is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So Pride and Prejudice is, of course, one of the most iconic classics in classic literature canon, and for so many reasons. One, because Jane Austen was so ahead of her time, and 2, no matter what year it is or what time period it is, there is something so universal about the feelings and emotions and story that her characters face. I always like to see Pride and Prejudice as the first romantic comedy, and that really led to and created and paved the road for all of the other romantic comedies that were to come. We of course have the many retellings of Pride and Prejudice, for instance, Bridget Jones' Diary, and of course it has the whole series, and it's all about that, whether it's a hate-to-love romance or different tropes that Jane Austen really created when she wrote Pride and Prejudice. I just finished reading the book Beach Read by Emily Henry, and this is a hate-to-love romance. But it's set in modern day, and so we can take these tropes that I really feel like the classics like Shakespeare and Jane Austen have created, and it's interesting to see how they have evolved over time. And so I think what makes Pride and Prejudice a classic is that it has universal themes, it has stood the test of time, people are still reading and getting stuff out of it today and relate to. And I think it's so funny when you can find such an old book and realize how the world has changed in so many ways, but also hasn't in so many ways as well. And I think this is a perfect example of that. The second way that I define a classic is an older book that is still being printed today. Now this is where things can get a bit debatable, because it really depends on each reader's opinion how old a book has to be considered a classic. And that's where I think things get really interesting, to see how other people define a classic in terms of time period. So if that's before the 1900s, before 1920, before the First or Second World Wars, I think it's so fascinating to see how other people consider what is a classic and maybe what is a modern classic. For me, a classic is any book written before the 1950s, and any book written between 1960 and 1990 is a modern classic. For instance, To Kill a Mockingbird, I would consider a modern classic, but The Great Gatsby I would consider a classic. But this, of course, is something that differs between readers, and that I think is perfectly fine and really interesting. The third way that I define a classic is an older book, specifically an older book, that has been read by many people. even better, read by people that don't typically consider themselves readers. This can be any book that has universal themes, like I said before, or a universal appeal. So whether you are interested in reading or not, it's a book that has some kind of appeal and draw to people. Many of these kinds of books are especially written in school, where it is forced upon you, or I guess required reading for students, but they are stories that even if they're not being voluntarily read, it is still really important, the actual reading of them. A lot of the books read in school are often coming-of-age stories. For example, we have The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, which was written in 1951, or The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, which was written in 1967, or Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, which was written in 1868. So as you can see, we have all of these coming-of-age stories which were written and published in different times, but they have those universal themes of growing up, growing older, and the different aspects and, I guess, trials and tribulations that come with growing up. And I think when you are approaching that as a student, and you're approaching classic literature for the first time, even though it is required reading, those are the books that no matter what, even if you go to people that don't consider themselves readers, and you ask them, what books did you read in high school, even if they didn't have an impact on them, you have those classic coming-of-age stories like The Catcher in the Rye that I think are classics because so many people have read them. They have universal appeal, universal themes, and whether it's voluntarily or required, I think those books have a very special place in people's hearts and in classic literature in general. There's a reason that they are being taught in school, I think. The fourth way that I define a classic is a work of literature that is referenced in modern culture, whether that is words or phrases from the book, or if they are referenced in modern media like film. An example of that is the phrase "in one fell swoop," which was first penned by William Shakespeare in 1623 in his play Macbeth. This is a collection of Shakespeare's tragedies. I don't actually have Macbeth as a standalone, but it of course is in this edition. And I think that there are so many words and phrases that we use in modern English, in modern day, that we don't even realize are from ages ago, from literature and from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I feel like I often say the phrase "in one fell swoop." People often say the phrase "in one fell swoop," at least in my life. Maybe you don't use the term "in one fell swoop," but it was first penned by William Shakespeare in 1623 in his play Macbeth, and I think that that's so fascinating. Another example of that could be Charles Dickens naming his character from A Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge, and the phrase "humbug," which is something that I don't think would have lasted till 2022 without it being referenced in modern media and so many adaptations of the story in films and things like that. So I think it's interesting to see how older phrases and older storylines are passed down through the generations and are still prevalent today and still in use today and still spoken today. I think it's so interesting, and I would definitely consider that to be any kind of classic. The fifth and last way that I typically define a classic is a book that I can return to and gain something new from it every time I return to it. Now, this typically is a book that would be considered old, stood the test of time, still printed today. All of the past definitions of how I define a classic, it would be under those as well. But this is a book because, like I said, you can return to any book, whether it's a classic or not, and gain something new from it. But I think there is something about classics that every time you read it, you get a new perspective, especially when you read it at different stages of your life. You get older, you have a different perspective on life, maybe your experience changed the way that you view things. Examples of these kinds of books for me is The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. This is one of my favorite books of all time. Every time I read it, I get something new from it, and it is one of those books that I think is perfect for everyone, children, young adults, the elderly. I think it's just one of those universal books with universal themes all about humanity and life and love and loss and beauty and hope, and this is just a universal book in itself, and again, I gain something new from it absolutely every time I read it. The second example of a book that I return to all the time and gain something new from it, of course you guys all saw this coming if you are familiar with my channel. I talk about this book in every one of my videos, and that's Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. This is my favorite book of all time because one of the many reasons of why it's my favorite book of all time is every time I return to it, I gain something new from it. I fall deeply, even more deeply in love with the characters every time I return to it. And this, I always say, is kind of like the book of life. It is the book of all books. It is life and humanity itself in just one volume, and Leo Tolstoy captures absolutely everything. Anna Karenina was written in 1878, and it was translated, of course, from the Russian, and even though it's a different culture from me, who I am American, and it was written so many years ago, there are so many themes in this book that I can relate to, I can see myself in, I can learn from and gain something from it, and I think that it's stood the test of time. It is still printed today for a very specific reason. People in Russia, students, read this book in school, so again, it's that universal appeal of, even though it's not maybe voluntarily being read, it is being introduced to students because it has such an important role in literature, in classic literature, and in the development of how books have become and changed from then until now. And it is one of those books that I think everybody should read because it is just a phenomenal book. So those are the 5 ways, I'm going to do 10 again, those are the 5 ways that I define a classic. So like I said before, I would absolutely love to know how you define a classic, so please feel free to leave that in a comment. I think this would be a really great start to a discussion, something that I think is so interesting to see how different people have different opinions and perspectives on what a classic is. And of course, please let us know what your favorite classics are. I would absolutely love to know that, so that if I haven't read any, I can change that and read them, and maybe film a video about them. So yes, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you have enjoyed and thought that it was interesting, the different ways that I defined a classic, and I look forward to seeing and reading and hearing how you guys define a classic. So I hope you are having a fantastic day reading some amazing books. I will see you soon in another video. Happy reading!